Thank you all for standing by and welcome to our webinar entitled Quantifying Nutrient Reduction in a Constructed Wetland System. This webinar series is called Freshwater Science and will highlight Ohio's Sea Grant and partnering scientists every month. Every quarter is a different focus, from human health and fish farming to harmful algal blooms and human decision making, bringing applied research to the public on issues that affect our Lake Erie communities. I am Jill Gentis-Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Dr. Ryan Winston from Ohio State University. Dr. Winston is a professor within Ohio State's Department of Food, Agriculture, and Biological Engineering. His research is focused on runoff hydrology and water quality, performance of stormwater control measures, often with a focus in urban environments. His current broad and applied research program spans runoff hydrology, water quality, stream and drainage management, modeling of urban runoff, and water quality field scale monitoring at small and large scales, and quantifying ecosystem services. We're delighted to have Dr. Winston here today to discuss his harmful algal bloom research initiative research. But before we do, just a few things about the webinar itself. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, around 12:20, I'll conduct a question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to pull up the chat feature at the bottom of your screen anytime during Dr. Winston's talk, and we'll collect and pose your questions out to him at the end of his presentation. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and is also has auto captioning. We'll post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the half an hour. Please feel free to take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey. It always helps us to continue to bring you great webinars. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Winston, presenting quantifying nutrient reduction in a constructed wetland system. Dr. Winston.
Thanks very much, Jill. Appreciate the excellent introduction and the invite for this webinar today. Great to see a lot of you here this afternoon, and hopefully more maybe listening later on a recorded video of this. Jill has done a great job introducing the topic. I'd just like to thank a couple of folks specifically. Sarah Valentine, Lindsay Horan, Abby Frazier, Laura Lair were really the four boots on the ground collecting a lot of the data that you're going to see in this presentation today. So just want to highlight their involvement in this project over the last 3 years now, as time has passed. So constructed wetlands, if you're not familiar with them, are one solution to stormwater, whether it's agricultural runoff or urban runoff. They do a good job of managing flood flows. They do a good job of mitigating water quality impairments by transforming and removing pollutants. They slow flows down. They allow for, they prevent erosion in receiving streams and other benefits. So constructed wetlands are one tool that we have as water managers to help us to sort of ameliorate the effects of runoff. Many of these systems are gravity driven. So we have a pipe at the inlet, the water flows through the wetland and then to an outlet, whether it's a storm sewer or a ditch in an agricultural case. So there's a lot of studies that have been done on these sort of inlet outlet wetlands. And there's also been a lot of research done on pumped wetlands. If you're from Central Ohio, the Olentangy River Wetland Complex on OSU's campus is a good example of a pumped wetland system where we're pumping out of the Olentangy River and polishing the water as it passes through those wetlands. So there's been a lot of research over the years on these two different types, broad types of wetlands, but not so much on floodplain wetlands. So that's what I'm going to talk about today in this webinar. So in terms of some of the challenges that we are dealing with, if you're from Central Ohio, last night we got somewhere between 2.5 and 4.5 inches of rain in 12 hours. About a 50-year recurrence interval event, once in 50-year probability. And you can see some examples of other flood events here, right? Hurricane Helene dropping more than 20 inches of rain on Western North Carolina, for example. So we seem to be getting these larger and larger events that are occurring more and more frequently. And a lot of our streams and rivers are really constrained, right? We've built levees alongside the river. We've built urban areas alongside the rivers where the water can't get out into a floodplain. So one of the purposes of this project was really to look at how well can a floodplain wetland work um, in treating flood flows and treating these high flows, and how much water can it peel off of a river when we do get these higher flow events. So just to give you a statistic, there's a ton of floodplain that's been lost just in the last 30 years. And if you go back historically a couple hundred years in this country, or 250 or more years in this country, there's been just lots and lots of floodplain disconnection that's been done through human involvement in river management. So reconnecting our rivers to floodplains, I think, is one of the things I'm going to try to highlight in this presentation. Without getting too technical here, there's a point at which water in a river. So this is the Great Miami River here that's being modeled. There's a point at which water has enough force to start to drive erosion in the river. And one of the things we've been thinking about in this project is, can we peel water off into a floodplain wetland and basically reduce the occurrence of this, what we call critical discharge, that causes erosion in the stream. So reduce the frequency at which that is occurring. So that's another reason why floodplain wetlands can be used, is to reduce in-stream erosion. So the project I'm going to speak with you about today is located on the East Fork of the Little Miami River. This is to the east of Cincinnati in Claremont County. The wetland site is located above a drinking water reservoir, which has recurrent harmful algal blooms. So thanks to the Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative for funding parts of this research. You can see Harsha Lake here. This is the receiving water, and obviously not a receiving water that you'd like to swim in or pull your drinking water out of, for example. So one of the reasons why this particular wetland has been implemented is to try to reduce the phosphorus loads that are coming out of the primarily agricultural watershed. And you can see on this slide, the watershed at the point where the wetland was implemented is about 163 square miles. So quite a big watershed. And of course, we're only pulling parts of the runoff into the wetland that I'm about to share with you. So this is an aerial photo of the wetland under construction. The East Fork of the Little Miami River is here in the background, running from sort of southeast in the picture to northwest. And you can see here the totality of this complex. It's about 10 acres in total. There was a retired drinking water reservoir in the foreground, which was reused as essentially a detention basin. So the water flows in here, flows in a sinuous pattern, and then the outlet is over on this side. When it rains, the water peels off of the river through this inlet connection here. There's a small forebay, which is there to really drop out sediment and still the flow of water, still slow the velocity of the water. And then the water either comes into this reservoir, as we call it, or it can bypass and go directly into this meandering treatment wetland that's in the background of the picture. If it doesn't bypass through this bypass channel here, it will go in, and it will take somewhere between 5 and 7 days for this detention basin to slowly dewater out through this meandering treatment wetland. And then the outlet reconnects to the river at the far downstream end. So this is essentially what it looks like. You can see it just after construction as things are starting to green up here. They left a lot of large woody debris that you can see scattered around in the treatment wetland. Bob Holly's group did the design on this at Sustainable Streams and did a really nice job, I think, of reusing a lot of the lumber, or the wood, excuse me, that was cut down as part of the construction. This sycamore tree I'll come back to on the question slide, so I'll just preview that for you. So the research objective really here was to look at how much pollutants are we sequestering. TSS, nitrogen, phosphorus were really our main goals. We're also looking at soils and vegetation in these systems. In this particular system, we have 8 transects where twice a year we collect soil and vegetation samples and send those off for nutrient analyses. So over the first 5 years of the project, we're about 3 years into monitoring now. Over the first 5 years, we'll get a really good idea of, is the vegetation or the soil a sink for nutrients? The jury's still out on that now, so I'm not gonna speak to that today. Treatment effectiveness over time is another thing we're trying to figure out. Over the first 5 years, how does treatment compare from year to year to year as this system matures? And then we're also doing some 2-dimensional hydraulic modeling and HEC-RAS to understand how different features in the wetland, either the meandering treatment wetland, the forebay, the reservoir feature, how do they all impact the performance of these systems so that hopefully we can translate that to other floodplain wetland sites that might be developed in the future, right? Informing future design of these systems. So this particular wetland has river-driven inflows. The wetland site is here. There is nicely a USGS gauge located 1.4 miles downstream. So shout out to them. Thanks for all their work on keeping that gauge running. We use that gauge to identify when flows are exceeding the depth, this roughly 4-foot depth here, where water connects from the river and actually floods out into the wetland that we're monitoring. So it's been a really, really helpful thing to have. And USGS does a great job with gauges. So thanks to them for providing a bit of data into this as well. Again, this is the wetland from above. Just to show you one more time, the East Fork is flowing from left to right here. Water comes into a small forebay. We have monitoring stations at the inlet to the reservoir right here. The reservoir is here. The outlet to the reservoir is here. We have another monitoring station there. We have a monitoring station in the bypass. We have a monitoring station at the inlet where the water first peels off of the river. And then we also have a monitoring station at the outlet. So we have 5 monitoring stations in total, 3 of which monitor the flow on the rising limb of the hydrograph and 2 of which monitor flow on the falling limb of the hydrograph. And the reason why we have to separate things that way is that this system is, the hydrology is really complex. As the river comes up, right, water flows into the inlet, but it also flows into the outlet of the system. And then vice versa, right? As the wetland is draining out, it's going to drain out through the outlet end of the meandering treatment wetland, but it's also going to flow out the inlet. And so that's a really complex thing to try to measure and to understand how the system is working. This is a slide on how we're doing the measurement. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip through that. So we have 3 monitoring sites where we're monitoring on the rising limb of the hydrograph. You can see the overall system inlet, the reservoir inlet, and also the bypass channel. So basically here, and here, we're measuring water quality on the rising limb to get an idea of what's coming into the wetland. And then on the falling limb, we take samples at the reservoir outlet here and also at the system outlet, the overall wetland system outlet. So that allows us to compare kind of what's coming in, an initial treatment in the forebay to what's going out of the reservoir and out of the system as a whole. And if you want more details on that, you could come back and look at the recording of this and read the calculations on the left in more detail. I'm not going to bore you with them right now. So one of the things that really has been a big takeaway of this project is sedimentation that's occurring at the inlet to the system. So again, this is the East Fork of the Little Miami River. The water peels off and kind of makes a left turn into the overall wetland complex here. And this is the sort of the inlet channel here. And what you might be able to make out is lots and lots of sediment that's accumulated as the water is peeling off of the river and going into the wetland. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because the water in the river is going to be very high velocity as it's moving through during a rainstorm. And when it gets into the wetland, it essentially has no velocity. So the sediment transport capacity goes from very high down to very low, right? And the sediment essentially drops out, particularly the large gravels and sands drop out at this inlet connection. That's a little bit problematic because what it does is it raises the elevation at which the water has to get to in the river in order to offload into the wetland. So one of the major maintenance things that's going to need to be done with this wetland and frankly other floodplain wetlands to some extent is excavation of this inlet over time. We do this about twice a year. We have to excavate out about 1 foot or 2 of soil that accumulates roughly every 6 months in order to keep that inlet open. So all stormwater controls require maintenance, and this is one of those pieces of maintenance for this wetland. We have a grant that's in hand through the Gulf Hypoxia Program. Claremont County got this award to re-engineer this inlet connection to hopefully provide better sediment transport capacity to get the sediment into the forebay, which is over here, and prevent it from dropping out upstream of the forebay. So that's one thing that we're going to be looking at as we continue our monitoring into 2027 and 2028. Okay, so I want to show you a little bit of data in the last 5 or so minutes that I have here. This is the inflow event summary for 2024. We had 8 events that offloaded water into the wetland in 2024. The plan was to have about 30 per year. The designer was planning for about 30, but again, that inlet connection elevation really restricts the size of events that offload water into the wetland. So what you can see here is the size of the rainfall events that offloaded water. We needed at least 3/4 of an inch or 2/3 of an inch of rain, but most of these events are north of 1 inch and some are north of 2. So we're really talking about relatively large events before flows enter the wetland. One of the cool things about this wetland, right, is that we're treating many millions of cubic feet of water. Just lots and lots of water are passing through the system. The other thing that we were able to show is that we're able to get relatively long residence time on the order of 5, 6, 7, 8 days. And that's really reliant on this reservoir, right? It's holding the flow back and very slowly releasing through a 4-inch orifice water into this wetland and allowing that wetland to, over a period of up to a week and a half, treat the water from the previous rainfall event. So this sort of residence time really allows us to get treatment of even dissolved pollutants, as I'll show you in just a second. So this is the TSS data for 2024. Concentrations in this left plot, loads in the right plot if you're interested. The influent monitoring sites, the overall system inlet, the reservoir inlet, and the bypass are shown to the left of the dashed lines. The reservoir outlet and the overall system outlet are shown to the right of the blue dashed lines. And what you can see broadly is we're getting a lot of treatment, right? Lots of sedimentation occurring, particularly between the system inlet and the reservoir inlet, which means our forebay is doing a lot of the work, but also between the reservoir inlet and the reservoir outlet, right? The reservoir is also a great place for sedimentation to occur. And we're removing upwards of 90% of the sediment that's coming into the system on the order of thousands of pounds per year, right? Which is the reason why we see that inlet starting to add sediment. But each event that comes through, that sediment accumulates and the elevation at which the river has to get to connect to the wetland increases. Total phosphorus reductions, similarly, we are seeing significant reductions even in the forebay from sedimentation, right? A lot of phosphorus is attached to sediment, so we're seeing some removal there. And we're seeing really good removals as we go from inlet to outlet. And this is in the first year after construction of the wetland. So from 1.2 milligrams per liter down to roughly 0.25. So 80%, 75, 80% reduction in concentration. And if we look at nitrogen, this total nitrogen here, not as good, but still reasonable reductions from about 2.5 milligrams per liter at the inlet to about 1 milligram per liter at the outlet. So solid reductions. And again, I also want to highlight, right, these are huge loads that we're treating because we have such massive volumes of water that are passing through this wetland. So overall, if you look at total suspended solids, 93% reduction, total phosphorus upwards of 60. Nitrogen, we're in that 40 to 50% range, depending on what particular parameter you look at. A lot of that removal is happening in the forebay, in that reservoir. The nitrogen then is really happening in that meandering treatment wetland. And I'm not going to get into it in great detail for lack of time, but that's what we've been able to show is that the reservoir is really critical to giving that meandering treatment wetland enough time to process the nitrogen. Okay, I wanted to just show quickly some contrast against what we found last year, 2025. So I showed you 2024 already. This is now the second year of data. We had 9 storm events that entered the wetland in 2025. Interestingly enough, they were even larger than the events in 2024. So we had about 65% more water come in 2025 than we did in 2024. And so one of the things I'm going to show you in just a second is some very different water quality data to what I just showed you from 2024. And what we think is happening is that we have such large volumes of water coming in that we're overwhelming some of the treatment processes. So one of the critical things, right, when you're building a wetland is to think about how much water am I putting through each time it rains? What's my design event? And in this case, I think we're to some extent overwhelming the wetland in certain cases. So here's the same sorts of plots here. This is total phosphorus, concentration on the left, load on the right, then dissolved reactive phosphorus down here if you're interested in that. And what you can see broadly is reductions on the influent hydrograph through the forebay and into the reservoir. Reservoir outlet also looks like it's getting continued reduction. But interestingly, the system outlet does seem to have more variability. So something's happening in that meandering treatment wetland, at least in these 9 of these. This is only 5 events that we were able to sample out of the 9. So that's another factor here. It could be that we just had a couple of outliers that we sampled that it's a small sample size is what I'm trying to say. But the point is that this outlet, it looks a bit different than the reservoir outlet, right? There's definitely differences here. We're still trying to tease out what those mean exactly. But this is definitely similar performance on the rising limb hydrograph sites, and then this is very dissimilar from what we saw in 2024. Total nitrogen, similarly, we're seeing kind of a little bit of a rise in nitrogen concentration as the water passes through the meandering treatment wetland, which is a bit odd. This could be, again, related to just the larger flows that are passing through the wetland in 2025 as compared to 2024. I did want to share a little bit of data on cost effectiveness because that's always a consideration. So what did it cost to build this thing? Well, the design, as you can see, was about on the order of $70,000 between design and permitting. Construction was about $611,000. That was mostly in earth moving. There was a lot of soil that was moved and excavated out of this area. Construction oversight about 20, and maintenance has been about $3,000 over the first 3 years, just excavation of that soil at the inlet that I've mentioned earlier. So cost to remove pollutants, if you look at per pound, you can see those costs here. They are, I think, relatively affordable. And obviously, as you add more and more removal over time, these costs will continue to come down as this wetland processes more that's tough for me to say, more nutrients and sediment over time. So I'm just going to wrap up here with some conclusions. I was hoping to get to a few other slides, but not going to have time. Runoff related conclusions here. This thing's highly effective at pollutant removal. We didn't look at metals or other emergent contaminants, but for the nutrients, for sediment, it's doing a great job of removing particulates. If you don't overwhelm it in terms of flow rates, it's also doing a great job of things like denitrification, particularly in 2024 was what we saw. The reservoir, we think, is a critical component here. If you have a floodplain wetland where the water is just being offloaded and then there's no storage component in that floodplain, the water is very quickly going to recede back into the river when the river elevation comes down. And that's really going to limit the hydraulic retention time in the wetland and therefore limit the pollutant removal that happens in that wetland. So having this retired drinking water reservoir as part of the overall pollutant removal sort of treatment train, if you will, we think is a really critical component that made this system work as well as it did. Let's see what else. Yeah, excellent performance overall. The inlet is really a problematic thing as far as maintenance goes. It's not problematic. It's a thing that you got to set and kind of do every 6 months to make sure that this wetland is going to continue to perform as desired. Just briefly going to show you real quick a couple of plots here or a couple of videos here of some velocity modeling that we're doing in HEC-RAS 2D on this wetland. HEC-RAS is really slick in that you can actually run the river hydraulics, but you can also run the flow through the wetland system. And so we're messing around in HEC-RAS 2D with this system and trying to calibrate to some of our data so that we can then pick apart as engineers, like how important is this forebay versus this meandering treatment wetland versus the reservoir, and how do we potentially redesign or rethink the design of those systems to get better pollutant removal. So we're also using the data. What I'm trying to say is we're also using the data to inform models, which hopefully will then be able to inform better decision making as far as engineering design goes for future floodplain wetlands in Ohio and beyond. So you can see some of the velocity vectors, for example, here in this video on the right, where you can tell, right, like this might be a critical erosional area here, right? So you can think about the design aspects and sort of rethink things a little bit with these types of models. So I'm going to stop there. I think I'm a few minutes over. I apologize, Jill. But this is a really cool picture. This is the sycamore I mentioned earlier, adjacent to the wetland, and that right there is a bald eagle. And the pair, the second one, is somewhere around there, often flying around the site when we're out there. So another nice ecosystem service. I'm sure every time the wetland floods, fish come out into the wetland, the water recedes, and it just becomes a buffet for these two bald eagles. There are fish everywhere, and they go to town on devouring them. So pretty cool to see them out there as well. All right, happy to take questions if there are any, Jill.
All right. Well, we've gotten We've gotten quite a few questions. So I'll get started and what questions that we'll try to get as many done as possible. I think we can do it. Um, let me see here. We got a lot of questions dealing with the construction of the wetlands itself. So one of the first questions someone asked was, are there regulated design standards for agricultural wetlands?
Yes, there are design standards out there for agricultural wetlands. Those I would recommend looking at the CREP program. I believe the CREP program has wetlands in it. Conservation Resource Enhancement Program, I think is what CREP stands for. If you Google that, there are definitely design standards out there through that program for agricultural wetlands. Um, if I can just broadly talk about floodplain wetlands really quickly, I think the key things here are to basically excavate as much soil as you can within the budget you have to make it simple, right? To get down to the brass tacks. So the point is, if you can excavate this whole area down another foot, from where we actually excavated in reality, then you increase the frequency that flows actually access the wetland. And if you have flows accessing the wetland more frequently, then you have more frequent treatment of water, right? So the costs in and the major construction in these kinds of floodplain wetland projects are in excavation and removal of soil, and hauling of soil. Hauling is a big cost. So in this case, we were able to find, we being broadly the construction contractor, was able to find local uh, farmers that were willing to take this soil. So they didn't have to truck it long distances, and that did help to bring the cost down substantially. Um, but yeah, the really one of the key factors is what elevation are you making the connection here at the inlet and the outlet? And that really determines how frequently the water enters the wetland and therefore how much treatment you get.
All right. One of the other questions was, what do you do with that soil? And you answered that by the farmers taking it. So that was another part of the question I was going to ask. So you answered that without even knowing.
Can I just add one thing to that, Jill? So,
Yeah,
so,
sure.
so as you can see, this was formerly the floodplain of this river, right? This would have historically been the floodplain. This was farmed pretty much all the way down to the river for a long time, and then was owned by the town of Williamsburg, and that's why the wetland was built where it was built. But the point is, because these soils next to streams are often relic floodplains, they're often full of nutrients, and they're usually pretty organic laden as well. And so what we were excavating out of this site, the farmers were excited to have. It wasn't crummy soil. It was really good quality stuff. I just wanted to make that point.
No, that's great. Thank you. We had a couple people that were they were wondering, like, one of their concerns was they said they were hesitant about constructing floodplain wetlands because of the potential of that river washing them out, or the wetland begins to feed warm water into the river system. So that was one of the reasons why they were really interested in the design of this wetland, because of those concerns.
Yeah, so really good questions. So I'll take the warm water question first. So certainly this river is going to be warmer during stormwater flows than during base flow. I think that stands to reason for most rivers, um, especially if you have any urbanization in the watershed. This watershed was about 70% ag, so primarily not urban, but if you have parking lots, the water can be much hotter, right, coming off the parking lot, especially in a summer day. What's been shown in the research literature is that wetlands, particularly if they have good vegetative cover, can actually cool runoff temperatures. So this is a picture right after construction, right? Not very good vegetative cover at all. Early days still. Now we're about 3.5 years after construction, and there's a pretty good, a lot of the trees have gotten to sort of 2 or 3 times my height, 15 feet tall, roughly. And there's a pretty good coverage of trees. And so I think in terms of temperature, the system nowadays is probably likely actually a sink for temperature rather than potentially increasing temperature. The other thing I would mention as it relates to it washing out is the existing riverbank is along here. It's really nicely vegetated with large trees, as you can see. There's only small cuts in that riverbank to make the connection, one here and one here at the inlet and outlet. And so the large majority of the forces are still kept in the stream. And by the time the water peels off into the wetland, it has almost no velocity. So in our experience, even during high flows, washouts are, I think, fairly unlikely, at least with this design.
Another question, we had a couple people asking about the maintenance and like how long this wetland will be effective and like as it gets older, will those percentage increase in terms of the nutrients or
Mhm.
decrease?
Mhm.
And you may or may not be able to answer some of that considering where you are in this wetland, but I
Yeah.
wanted you to have the opportunity in case you can answer that.
I think it's a great question. So in terms of maintenance, there's several maintenance items that sort of pop up or come to front of mind. The first is the inlet connection here. You can see the sediment accumulation across the inlet. That's an obvious one. That one has to be dug out a couple times a year. It's about a half a day of work with a mini hoe excavator. It's not a ton of work. They dump the soil up on the banks up here, seed over it, and you're good to go for another 6 months. The other major maintenance is really trash and debris. There's not a lot of trash and debris in this particular river. Again, it's mostly agriculture, but if you have a more urban watershed, these kinds of floodplain wetlands, I could see trash and debris being an issue. And the other one is invasive plants, right? Managing things like cattails, and Phragmites really don't get this far south per se, but if you're in Columbus or Cleveland, Phragmites are more of an issue. Those two are really, when you're first planting a wetland, really critical to keep on top of as far as herbicide treatment. Otherwise, the plants that you want to be there will get crowded out by those. So that's the major maintenance side of things. As far as thinking about like prognosticating how well this thing's going to work in 5, 10, 20 years, great question. We do have funding through HABRI. Thank you very much, HABRI, for monitoring up through 2028. So we will have data through the first 5 years of this wetland's life, continuous data, which is really cool. I think we'll try to continue to find research funding to continue that if we can. And if not, some of the other studies that we've been doing recently on things on more urban BMPs like bioretention, ponds, and permeable pavements, we've been doing a lot of either midlife, late in life, end of life research studies where we're looking at like how are these performing after 5, 8, 10, 12, 15 years in the ground, 20 years in the ground even. And a lot of them, the short story is a lot of them are still performing really well. Sometimes even better than the first year or two of life because, for instance, the vegetation hasn't matured, and therefore a lot of the biological processes that are reliant on vegetation, both plant uptake as well as microbial processes, they haven't gotten their full potential yet. So, yeah, certainly soil absorption processes are not unlimited. Um, but vegetation-based processes, microbial processes, those have a much longer window for them to occur, right? So sedimentation, again, if you clean out the inlet, much longer window for them to occur, many decades. So
Okay. Do you know if there are any plans to do something similar to this, like say in other areas like the Maumee River Basin?
So I'm not sure about the Maumee specifically, but there are several other floodplain wetlands like this that have been constructed in various places in Ohio. So I showed one early picture here. This is on the Great Miami, up just south of Dayton. I want to say this project was constructed. So there are, if you're interested, send me an email. This paper here, Hawley et al., this is Bob Hawley, if some of you may be familiar. Um, I'm a co-author on this as well. He goes through kind of takeaways from construction and design of about 8 or 9 large floodplain wetland projects. Not all of them are in Ohio, some are in Kentucky. I think maybe one in Indiana, if I remember right. But there are you know, getting probably north of 10 easily at this point, and I know of several others that are in design or planning at the moment as well. One on the Scioto, for example, south of Columbus. So yeah.
Okay. I have one question that I wanted to ask, and then I had a couple that were more of the nitty-gritties of like numbers. If
Sure.
you're okay with sticking around for another 5 minutes or
Yeah.
so, are you still okay?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Okay, the I thought this was a really good question, so I wanted to ask this one. Are there any take-homes from this work about selecting sites for restored floodplain wetlands to have the most effective phosphorus removal?
Ooh, good question. So I would say I'm trying to find a picture that shows this. One takeaway at this site is this site was owned by the city, so that was the reason why this site was chosen. City is a stretch; it's a town. It was owned by the town of Williamsburg. So this is the river here, and you can kind of see it's this left-hand meander bend, and then it kind of straightens out by the wetland, right? And so, as you might imagine, if you've ever studied river hydraulics, right, the force on this meander bend is on the outside of the river, right? That's where all the velocity is. That's where that's where the water's going to want to tend to flow is on the outside. And on this inside, right, a point bar is going to form if you go back to if you ever took a geomorphology class. So the point is a lot of the high velocity flows are out here, and we're asking the water to enter the wetland from the inside of the river. So I think ideally you would actually flip-flop this wetland and put it on the outside of the meander bend because the water is going to want to naturally kind of make its way into the wetland anyway. So that would be one is try to pick a location where water is going to naturally want to flow in, where you're not going to have to engineer it or force it in. Because what we see in this system and in a lot of other BMPs is if you can't get the water in, it doesn't matter how well you build the system. Um, it's just not going to do a very good job of treating pollutants. I did see a question that popped up about what fraction of the overall nutrient load is this wetland treating from this watershed. It's a great question. We haven't done calculations on it, but I would guess it would be a very small fraction, right? I mentioned the watershed to this point is 163 square miles. Um, it's a massive amount of water that's moving through. And again, this wetland is only seeing about 8 or 9 storm events a year, and we average about 60 or 70 storm events a year at least in Ohio on a given year. So I would guess it's still well less than 1% of the overall phosphorus load, right? So you'd have to do these practices if you're thinking about a river basin scale, you'd have to do these practices at a relatively large scale to do 40% phosphorus reduction, for example. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you answered one of my questions.
Sorry about that.
That was one of the nitty-gritties, so let me see. Another one was, did you measure pH and dissolved oxygen, redox status at each of the stations? Is there any chance that dissolved oxygen is, and sorry, there's something low, I think though, at the outlet, which could result in release of DRP? That can
Yeah.
happen if dead vegetation accumulates and decomposes.
So the short answer to the first question is no, but it's a great point. We do have some dissolved oxygen sensors in our lab that are collecting dust at the moment, and so it's a great idea. I think we might go ahead and do that over the next few weeks. That's an awesome idea. I would expect the DO to be relatively low in a wetland, right? And yeah, your point is well taken, right? Like a lot of our monitoring. So I didn't get into this point in the presentation, but I'll just mention it quickly. A lot of the actual storm events where we see flow in this wetland are occurring in the winter and in the spring. So if you look at these are the 8 events in 2024. They occurred between January and May. There's no connection between the river and the wetland from May 7th through the end of the year. So basically, you need those lower evapotranspirative times of the year where vegetation is dead. Water table is going to come up in the watershed, and that is going to create more runoff in the river per unit amount of rainfall, right? So that drives sort of a seasonality to the hydrology here, where we're getting most of our flows in the winter and the spring. And so the person's point is well taken insofar as particularly in the winter, the vegetation is senesced, right? It's all died, it's laying over, it's likely to decompose. And so when we come back and we monitor in 2025, 2024 was early days as far as the vegetation was concerned. It was still juvenile. But 2025, when we saw these differences in water quality, right, could that be related to senescence of vegetation during the winter when most of our flows are occurring, or early spring when most of our flows are occurring? I think absolutely. Yes, I think it could be. So really good point, really good question, and I think might spur us to do some DO and some pH measurements here in the future.
All right, perfect. Um, Another question that I'll do two more if you're okay with it.
Sure.
Um, First one was asked, was erosion observed in the meandering portion for 2025?
Nope. Nope. No, by 2025, so yeah, good question, right? Because the flows were much higher coming through the wetland. But by 2025, the vegetation was really thick. We take vegetation and soil samples twice a year, and it's actually a really complex thing to do now because it's hard to find our transects because the vegetation has gotten so vigorous. So there may be some small points of erosion, but on the whole, I would say no, it has not been an issue.
Okay. One last question, and I don't think you answered this one, but tell me if you did.
Okay.
What percentage of total yearly total phosphorus load is this project removing? Does this stream have a reduction target?
Yeah, great question. So I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'll kind of try to answer it in a little bit different way. So Harsha Lake is the lake downstream that this river flows into, and it does have algal blooms. Um, I know for Northwest Ohio, for example, they're looking at 40% reductions in total phosphorus as the goal. So I don't know that there's one necessarily for Harsha Lake, but if you want to use that as a relative target, it would be a reasonable thing to do, I think. If we go back to the 2024 data, you can see that we're easily hitting that. 40% is below what we're seeing in 2024, at least in terms of phosphorus load reductions. However, right, we're not treating all of the water that goes to the river, right? This isn't like a wetland that we stuck in the middle of the river and we force all the flows to go through. In fact, if we did that, it would blow out very quickly, and also there'd be lots of permitting challenges with building a wetland in the middle of a blue line stream. But anyway, the point is that we're probably I would need to do the calculations, but I'm guessing we're treating less than 1% of the annual flow through the river. So even though we're retaining 64% of TP, that's only for the water passing through the wetland, right? So I would guess we're making less than a 1% change in phosphorus on the whole from this 163 square mile watershed. But it's
Okay.
something we'll take a look at and make a calculation on because I do think it's a good point.
All right.
Yeah.
I think those were the major ones. I think I got the bulk of the questions. Um, so let me, since we are close to a quarter till, let me just wrap things up here for everyone. I wanted to thank again Dr. Winston for his willingness to talk to us about his HABRI research. This was really an excellent presentation, so thank you, Dr. Winston, for that. I did want to remind everyone that the survey URL for the webinar is in the chat feature, so please take a few minutes to fill that out. This webinar series is sponsored by Ohio Sea Grant and will continue next month with Bowling Green State University's Kevin Neves talking about fish otolite otoliths' ability to impact predation, migration, and fish success. That registration link is in the chat. Thank you again, Dr. Winston, and all the participants on this webinar. We hope this was beneficial and hope you'll join us again in an upcoming webinar. Thank you again. Have a great weekend or weekend. Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Thanks again, Dr. Winston.